Hey, welcome back to English in Fluency. I'm Alex, and if you've landed on this video, I want you to know you're exactly where you need to be right now. Whether you've been studying English for a few months or a few years, there's something really specific that I want to talk to you about today. Something that a lot of learners overlook, and it's this: understanding how native speakers signal that they're about to give you an example. Think about the last time you were listening to someone speak in English, maybe a podcast, maybe a movie, maybe a conversation with a colleague, and suddenly you got a little lost. The words were fine. You understood most of them. But the meaning? That slipped away, and you weren't sure why. Well, I'll tell you why. A huge part of listening comprehension isn't just about vocabulary or grammar. It's about understanding the structure of speech. It's about knowing when a speaker is about to change direction, add more detail, or bring in an illustration to help you understand their point. And that's exactly what today's lesson is about. We're going to look at how speakers signal new examples. We're going to practice recognizing those signals in real conversations. And by the end of this video, you're going to feel so much more confident when you listen to real, natural English. So please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. And let's get into it. So let's start at the very beginning. What do I mean when I say signaling an example? Here's the simple version. When someone is explaining something, a concept, an idea, a feeling, a situation, they often use examples to make that idea clearer. But they don't just jump straight to the example without warning. They use specific words and phrases to tell you, "Hey, I'm about to show you what I mean." These are called signaling phrases or discourse markers, and they are absolutely everywhere in natural English speech. The reason this matters so much is that when you hear one of these phrases, it's a cue. It's the speaker saying, "Okay, I've made my point. Now I'm going to bring it to life." If you miss that cue, you might think the speaker has changed topics entirely. Or you might get confused about what they're trying to say. But when you recognize it, suddenly everything clicks. The example makes sense, the main point makes sense, and you're following the conversation smoothly. Let me show you what I mean with a simple scenario. Imagine a coworker is explaining to you why they prefer working from home. They say something like, "I just feel so much more productive when I'm at home." Like, for instance, yesterday I finished 3 reports in the morning and still had time to take a proper lunch break. That never happens at the office. Now, did you notice what happened there? They made a general statement. They feel more productive at home. And then they used "for instance" to signal an example. The example was the 3 reports and the lunch break. That example wasn't random. It was there specifically to support and explain the main point. This is exactly the kind of thing we're going to be practicing today. And we're going to go through it slowly, thoroughly, and with lots of practice so that it becomes second nature to you. Now, let me introduce you to the most common signaling phrases that speakers use when they're about to give an example. There are more than you might think, and they each carry a slightly different flavor or feeling. Let me walk you through them one by one. The first and probably the most common is "for example." This one is so widely used that you've almost certainly heard it many times. It's clean, clear, and direct. When a speaker says, "for example," they are literally saying, I'm about to show you a specific case of what I just said. Simple as that. You'll hear it in formal conversations, in lectures, in casual chats, everywhere. For example, if someone says, "I love outdoor activities," for example, "I go hiking almost every weekend," you know immediately that hiking is there to illustrate what outdoor activities means to this person. The second phrase is "for instance." This one is very similar to "for example," but it tends to feel slightly more conversational and a little softer. Native speakers use it all the time in casual speech. If your friend says, "The service at that restaurant was terrible. For instance, we waited over 40 minutes just to get the menu," you know that the 40-minute wait is an example used to prove how bad the service was. Then we have "such as." Now, this one is a little different in how it's placed. "Such as" usually appears right before the example, and it's often used to introduce a list of examples. You might hear something like, "There are many ways to improve your vocabulary, such as reading books, watching movies in English, or keeping a word journal." Do you notice how naturally that flows? The phrase "such as" works like a smooth bridge between the general idea and the specific examples. Next up is "like." This is a very informal and very common way to introduce examples in spoken English, especially among younger speakers or in casual conversation. If someone says, "I've been trying to eat healthier lately," like, "I switched to salads for lunch," and "I cut out sugary drinks," they're using "like" as a casual signal for an example. You'll hear this one a lot in everyday speech, so it's really important to recognize it. We also have "to give you an example," or "let me give you an example." These are fuller, more complete phrases that speakers use when they want to slow down and really set up the example clearly. This often happens when the speaker is aware that the topic is complex, and they want to make sure you follow them. If someone says, "The issue with climate change is really quite complicated. Let me give you an example of how it affects everyday life," they're preparing you to receive a detailed illustration. Pay attention when you hear this. It means something important is coming. Another phrase is "take," for example. This one is used when the speaker wants to draw your attention to a specific, often well-known or easily imagined scenario. They're asking you to focus on one particular case. Take, for example, the city of Amsterdam. It's been built on canals for centuries, which shows that humans have always found creative ways to deal with geographical challenges. The speaker is using Amsterdam as one clear illustration of a much bigger idea. And then we have "imagine" or "picture this." These are slightly different because they introduce a hypothetical example, a scenario that may not be real, but is being used to help you understand a concept. Imagine you're in a job interview, and the interviewer asks you an unexpected question. How do you respond? That's a hypothetical scenario used to help you understand a broader point about communication skills. Finally, there's "as an illustration" or "to illustrate." These are more formal expressions, and you'll hear them in academic or professional contexts, presentations, lectures, serious discussions. To illustrate how quickly technology has changed, consider the fact that 20 years ago, most people had never heard of a smartphone. This phrase tells you that a specific example is being used as proof or evidence for the main claim. Now that we have our vocabulary of signaling phrases, let's do some listening practice. I'm going to share several conversations with you. As you listen or read along, I want you to focus on two things. First, identify the signaling phrase. Second, identify what the example is and what main point it's supporting. Ready? Let's go. Conversation. 1. Two friends named Maya and Daniel are talking at a coffee shop. Maya says, "I've been feeling really overwhelmed with everything lately. Like, there's just too much going on at once." Daniel replies, "I totally get that. What's been the hardest part?" Maya says, "Honestly, just keeping up with everything at work. For example, last week I had 4 deadlines in 3 days and I barely slept. And then I get home and there's a pile of things to deal with there too." Daniel nods and says, "Yeah, that's a lot. Have you thought about maybe breaking things into smaller tasks? To give you an example of what I do, I write down the 3 most important things I need to do each day, and I only focus on those. Everything else waits." Take a moment to think about that conversation. What signaling phrases did you notice? Maya used "like" right at the beginning. Like, there's just too much going on at once. Then she used "for example" to bring in the specific example of the 4 deadlines. And Daniel used "to give you an example of what I do" to introduce his own personal example as a piece of advice. Each one of those phrases is doing the same job, pointing you toward the example, making sure you know it's there to support a larger point. Now let's look at conversation 2. This one is between a teacher named Sandra and a student named Oliver. Sandra says, "Oliver, I want to talk about your essay. Your main argument is strong, but I think you need more concrete support. Do you know what I mean?" Oliver says, I think so. Like, I need more facts?" Sandra says, "Partly yes, but also more real-world illustrations. Take, for example, your paragraph about social media. You say it creates anxiety, which is a strong point, but then you don't show me why or how. You need to illustrate that. For instance, you could mention a specific study, or describe a scenario that makes it real for the reader." Oliver says, "Okay, so kind of like, imagine someone scrolling through Instagram and constantly comparing themselves to perfect-looking photos?" Sandra smiles and says, "Exactly. That's a perfect illustration. That's the kind of thing that brings your argument to life." In this conversation, notice how Sandra uses "take," for example, to point Oliver toward a specific part of his essay. Then she uses "for instance" to give him options. And Oliver himself picks up the technique and uses "imagine" to create a hypothetical example. Even within a short conversation, these phrases appear multiple times, each time doing slightly different work. Let's do a third conversation. This one is between 2 colleagues, Priya and Marcus, who are discussing a project at work. Marcus says, "I really think we should change our approach to the customer feedback process. Right now, it's too slow." Priya says, "I agree, but what specifically needs to change?" Marcus says, "Well, for starters, the time it takes from when a customer submits feedback to when they hear back from us. Such as, if someone emails a complaint on Monday, they shouldn't have to wait until Friday for a response. That's just too long." Priya says, "True. And another thing, the feedback form itself is confusing. Like, there are too many questions and half of them aren't relevant. To illustrate what I mean, if a customer just wants to report a billing error, they still have to answer questions about their overall satisfaction with the product. That doesn't make sense." Marcus says, "Exactly. So, To give you an example of what I've seen work at other companies, they use a simple triage system. You pick one category, answer 2 or 3 short questions, and that's it. Again, look at all the signaling happening in that conversation, such as used to introduce a specific scenario, like used to casually flag an example. To illustrate what I mean, used to set up a longer, more detailed example. And, to give you an example of what I've seen, used to introduce a practical comparison. Every one of those moments is a speaker saying, "Here's proof, here's evidence, here's a real picture of what I mean." Now, let's take this a step further. Because listening isn't just about recognizing individual phrases, it's also about following the full structure of what a speaker is saying. And understanding examples is a big part of that. When a speaker gives an example, there's usually a 3-part structure. First, they make a general statement or claim. Second, they signal that an example is coming. Third, they give the example. Sometimes, after the example, they wrap up with a comment or conclusion. Let me show you this with a longer piece of speech. Let's say someone named Nathan is giving a short talk about the importance of sleep. He says, "Most people underestimate just how much sleep affects their daily performance. And I don't just mean feeling tired. I'm talking about real, measurable impacts on your ability to think clearly, make decisions, and even regulate your emotions. For example, research shows that people who sleep less than 6 hours a night make significantly more mistakes at work than those who get 7 or 8 hours. To illustrate this even further, imagine trying to solve a complex problem after a night of only 4 hours of sleep. Your brain is literally running on reduced fuel. It's like trying to drive a car with an almost empty tank. You might get somewhere, but not very far, and not very efficiently. This is why sleep isn't a luxury. It's a foundation. Let's break that down together. Nathan's general claim is that sleep affects daily performance. He signals he's expanding on this with, "I'm talking about." Then he uses, "for example," to introduce research evidence. Then he uses, to illustrate this even further, to add a hypothetical scenario, the 4 hours of sleep problem. And then he uses "it's like," which is actually another informal way to signal an example or comparison. To compare the brain to a car with an empty tank. The whole thing is layered with examples, each one building on the last. And if you can follow that structure, you can follow almost anything. I want to stop here and give you a really important tip. When you're listening to someone speak in English, especially in longer, more complex speech, try to listen for these signaling phrases like you would listen for road signs. When you're driving in a new city, you don't just look at the road in front of you. You look for signs that tell you what's coming: a turn, a junction, a speed limit. Signaling phrases are exactly like that. They tell you, "Get ready. A new piece of information is about to arrive. This is what it's for." Once you start listening for them, you'll notice they're everywhere. In news reports, when the journalist says, "as an example of this growing trend." In academic lectures, when the professor says, "to illustrate this concept." In everyday conversations, when your friend says, "like for instance, the other day." These phrases are constant companions of good communication. And here's the thing. Once you start recognizing them in listening, you'll also start using them more naturally in your own speaking. That's the double benefit. Your listening gets better, and your speaking gets richer and more organized at the same time. Let me now introduce you to something I call clarification chains. This is when a speaker doesn't just give one example, they give multiple examples in a row. Or they give an example and then immediately clarify or expand it. These chains can be a little tricky to follow if you're not used to them, but once you see the pattern, they become much easier. Here's a clarification chain from a conversation between two friends, Lena and James, who are discussing why Lena is thinking of changing careers. Lena says, "I just don't feel fulfilled at my job anymore. I mean, I do the work, it's fine, but there's no passion there. Like, for example, when I finish a project, I don't feel proud or excited. I just feel done. It's like, imagine running a race and crossing the finish line, but instead of feeling a rush, you just feel nothing. That's what it's like for me every time I close out a task. And it's not just about the projects either. Like, even the environment. For instance, every Monday morning I sit down at my desk and I genuinely dread the day. That's not normal, right? That's not how work should feel. Now look at what Lena is doing there. She makes a general statement. She's not fulfilled. She adds, like, for example, to bring in a specific feeling. Finishing a project without pride. Then she uses, it's like, imagine, to add a comparison, a hypothetical. Then she shifts to another dimension, the environment, and uses, for instance again, to support that. She's building a picture, piece by piece, example by example, illustration by illustration. And James, as the listener, is being guided along that path. When you listen to real English speech, you'll hear people do this all the time. It's not messy or random. It's actually a very human and natural way of communicating. People think in layers. They explain in layers. And when they do, they use these signals to hold your hand through each layer. Let's practice identifying clarification chains now. I'm going to give you another longer passage, and I want you to follow each step. This one features a character named Sophia, who is explaining to her friend Ben why she thinks learning a second language is so valuable. Sophia says, "Honestly, learning a second language changed my life in ways I didn't even expect. Like, I thought it would just help me communicate with more people. And it did, obviously. But there were so many other benefits I didn't see coming. For example, my memory got noticeably better. I started being able to remember names, numbers, directions, all of that improved. To give you a more specific example, I used to be really bad with people's names. Like, I'd meet someone and forget their name immediately. After I started learning Spanish, that changed. I think it's because language learning trains your brain to hold and organize information differently. And it's not just memory. For instance, I also became a much better listener in my native language too. Because when you're learning a new language, you have to pay such careful attention to every word, every sound. And that habit carries over. Imagine if you had to focus that intensely on every conversation. You'd catch so much more, right? That's what happened to me. Like, I started noticing things in conversations that I used to completely miss. Tone, hesitation, word choice. It was like turning on a new set of ears. Beautiful, right? Sophia uses like casually several times. She uses for example for a general benefit. She uses to give you a more specific example to zoom in further. She uses for instance to introduce a different benefit. And she uses imagine to bring you into a hypothetical experience. She also uses it was like at the end as a comparison. Every single one of those moments is a signal telling you, this is an example. This is here to help you understand. Now, let me talk about something slightly different but closely related. Sometimes speakers don't give examples of real things. Instead, they use analogies, comparisons that help explain an abstract concept. Analogies are a form of illustration, and they're usually introduced with phrases like, it's similar to, think of it as, or it's kind of like. These are slightly different from straightforward examples, but the function is the same. They're there to make an abstract idea more concrete and easier to understand. Let's listen to a conversation between two friends, Kevin and Rachel, who are discussing how to deal with stress. Kevin says, "I've been trying this new approach to dealing with stress. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, I just focus on one thing at a time." Rachel says, "That makes sense, but isn't it hard not to think about everything else?" Kevin says, "Yeah, at first. But think of it as okay, imagine you have 100 windows open on your computer. What happens?" Rachel says, "It slows down." Kevin says, "Exactly. Your brain is the same. Every problem you keep open in your head is taking up processing power. So what I do is close the tabs I can't deal with right now and just focus on one." It's similar to how a surgeon doesn't think about anything else when they're in the middle of an operation. They have to give everything to one task. Rachel says, "Oh, that's a really good way of putting it." In that exchange, Kevin uses "think of it as like," and then "imagine" to introduce an analogy, the computer with too many open windows. Then he uses "it's similar to" bring in another analogy, the surgeon. These aren't real-world examples from his life. They're mental pictures designed to make his point clear. And they work, don't they? You can immediately picture that computer slowing down. You can immediately understand what he means about focusing. This is such a powerful listening skill. When you hear "it's like," or "think of it as," or "similar to," you know you're about to receive an image, a comparison, something that will light up your understanding. Be ready for it. Let's take a short pause from conversation examples and talk about how these signals appear in slightly more formal or structured contexts, like a class, a speech, or a presentation. The phrases are often the same, but the style is a little different. In formal settings, speakers tend to be more deliberate and explicit about their examples. Imagine you're listening to a talk by a speaker named Dr. Claire, who is explaining the concept of cognitive bias. She says, "Cognitive biases are mental shortcuts that our brains use to process information quickly. While they're often helpful, they can also lead us to make poor decisions or misinterpret situations." To illustrate this, let me walk you through one of the most well-known biases, the confirmation bias. This is the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. Take, for example, someone who believes that a particular diet is the best one for health. They will tend to notice and remember every article that supports that diet, and they'll overlook or dismiss every study that suggests otherwise. As another illustration, consider how confirmation bias plays out in political discussions. People on both sides of an issue tend to follow news sources and social media accounts that align with their existing views. This reinforces what they already think, rather than challenging them to consider new perspectives. Notice how Dr. Clare uses "to illustrate this" at the start to signal a major example is coming. Then she uses "take," for example, to introduce the diet example. Then she uses as another illustration to transition to a second, different example, the political one. In formal speech, speakers often signal very clearly when they're moving from one example to another. This helps the audience track the structure of the argument. In your listening practice, whenever you hear formal signal phrases like these, it's helpful to mentally note: first example, diet; second example, politics. That kind of active listening makes a huge difference to your comprehension. Let's do a longer practice passage now. This one is a simulated radio interview between a host named Michael and a guest named Dr. Nadia, who studies human behavior. As you read or listen, keep tracking all the example signals you notice. Michael says, "Dr. Nadia, thank you for being here. Let's talk about something you mentioned in your recent paper. The idea that small habits have an outsized impact on our well-being. Can you explain what you mean by that?" Dr. Nadia says, "Of course. So the core idea is that it's not the big dramatic changes in our lives that usually determine how we feel day to day. It's the small, consistent behaviors that add up. For example, something as simple as making your bed in the morning has been shown in multiple studies to correlate with higher productivity and a greater sense of control throughout the day. It sounds almost too small to matter, right? But the act of completing one task first thing in the morning sets a tone. It's like, imagine you're an athlete warming up before a game. The warm-up itself doesn't win the game, but it prepares your body and mind. That's what small habits do." Michael says, "That's a fascinating way to look at it. Can you give us another example?" Dr. Nadia says, "Absolutely. Think about the habit of writing down 3 things you're grateful for each evening. To give you a specific example, in one study, participants who did this for just 2 weeks reported feeling significantly less anxious and more optimistic than those who didn't. And the beautiful thing is that the habit itself takes maybe 3 minutes. That's the outsized impact I'm talking about. A 3-minute habit producing 2 weeks of measurable psychological improvement. As another illustration, and this one I love, consider the simple habit of walking for 20 minutes a day. Not running, not an intense workout, just walking. Research shows it can reduce symptoms of depression by up to 30% in some populations. 30% from a 20-minute walk. Michael says, "Wow, so why do you think people tend to underestimate these small habits?" Dr. Nadia says, "It's a great question. I think it comes down to our bias toward dramatic action. We're wired to think that big results require big effort. For instance, if you want to lose weight, you think, I need to completely overhaul my diet and exercise 6 days a week. But that kind of extreme approach is usually unsustainable. Whereas building one small habit, such as drinking a glass of water before every meal, can have lasting, compounding effects over time. Like, to give you a more personal example, I started drinking herbal tea every night before bed about 3 years ago. Just that, one small change, and it genuinely changed my sleep, which changed my energy, which changed everything else. Now that was a rich passage, wasn't it? Let's count the signals. For example, appeared to introduce the bed-making example. It's like, imagine, introduced an analogy about the athlete warming up. To give you a specific example, introduce the gratitude study. As another illustration, introduce the walking research. For instance, introduce the weight loss mindset example, such as introduce the water drinking habit. And, to give you a more personal example, introduce Dr. Nadia's own story. That's 7 clear signaling moments in one interview. And each one is doing exactly the same job, pointing you to an illustration that supports the main point. Now, I want to give you a practice task. I'm going to describe a scenario, and I want you to try writing or saying your own response using at least 3 example signals. The scenario is this. Your friend is feeling unmotivated to exercise. You want to explain to them why even small amounts of exercise are beneficial. Take a moment. Think about what you'd say. Think about the main point you want to make, and what examples or illustrations you could use to support it. Maybe you talk about a short walk after dinner. Maybe you mention something you read about endorphins. Maybe you use an analogy, like comparing exercise to charging your phone. Whatever you choose, practice connecting it to a signal phrase. When you do this kind of active practice, you're not just learning to recognize signals, you're internalizing them. And that's when real fluency starts to happen. You don't just hear them and understand, you start producing them naturally without even thinking about it. Let's shift now to something I find really interesting. The way speakers use clarifications, not just examples. Sometimes a speaker doesn't give you a brand new example. Instead, they sense that what they just said might be unclear, and they immediately rephrase or add detail. This is called a clarification, and it's often introduced with phrases like, "What I mean is," in other words, "to put it another way," "by that I mean," or "let me rephrase that." These are slightly different from example signals, but they're closely connected. They're both forms of the speaker saying, "I want to make sure you're following me." Let's look at a short conversation where clarification signals appear naturally. 2 friends, Anna and Peter, are talking about why Anna has decided to spend less time on social media. Anna says, "I just realized I was consuming too much noise, like too much information that wasn't actually useful or meaningful to me." Peter says, "What do you mean by noise?" Anna says, "Oh, sorry, let me clarify. What I mean is content that doesn't actually add anything to your life. In other words, scrolling through posts that you don't really care about, or getting into comment arguments that just make you feel worse. To put it another way, imagine your brain is a cup, and you only have so much space. Every piece of content you consume fills that cup. If you fill it with noise, there's no room for the things that actually matter." Can you see how Anna uses clarification signals to help Peter understand? She uses "what I mean is" to rephrase noise in clearer terms. Then, in other words, to break it down even further. Then, to put it another way, to introduce an analogy, the cup metaphor. Clarification chains like this are extremely common in natural speech, and once you recognize them, you'll follow conversations so much more smoothly. Now let's talk about one more very important thing. Sometimes listeners, that's you, don't just receive examples passively. In a real conversation, you can respond to examples and ask for more. Knowing how to signal that you want a clarification or another example is a valuable skill on its own. Phrases that you as a listener might use include, "Can you give me an example?" "What do you mean exactly?" Could you illustrate that? Do you have an example of that? Or more casually, like, what do you mean? Can you show me what that looks like? Or, what would that be like in practice? These requests essentially invite the speaker to use the signaling phrases we've been studying. When you ask, "Can you give me an example?" you're inviting a "for example," or a "for instance," or a "to illustrate." You're creating the space for the signal to happen. And understanding this dynamic makes you a much more active and effective listener and conversationalist. Let me show you this in a conversation. Two roommates, Clara and Tom, are discussing how to handle a noisy neighbor situation. Tom says, "I think we need to be more assertive." Clara says, "What do you mean by assertive? Like, what would that look like?" Tom says, "Good question. For example, instead of just ignoring it when they play music late at night, we could politely knock on the door and explain how it affects us. Or, to give you another example, we could leave a friendly note explaining our situation." Clara says, "Okay, I see. And by politely, what do you mean exactly?" Tom says, "I mean calm and respectful. In other words, not aggressive or passive-aggressive. Like, instead of saying, 'You're so loud and it's really inconsiderate,' you'd say something like, 'Hey, we have early mornings, and it would really help us if the music could be a bit quieter after 10. Would that be okay?" In that conversation, Clara is actively requesting clarification and examples. Every time she asks a question, Tom responds with a signal phrase and an illustration. This back and forth is exactly how real communication works, and being aware of it on both sides, as the speaker and as the listener, makes you so much more capable in English. Let me now bring everything together with one final extended practice passage. This is a longer, more natural piece of speech. A character named Dr. Samuel is giving an informal talk at a community event about the importance of kindness in daily life. As you read, I want you to follow every example, every illustration, every clarification. Really track the structure. Notice how the examples build on each other. Notice when the speaker zooms in for more detail. Notice when he uses analogies versus real-world scenarios. Dr. Samuel says, "You know, when I was growing up, my grandmother used to say that kindness is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And I've spent a lot of my career thinking about what she meant by that. And I think she was onto something profound. Because kindness isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. It's something you do, often consciously, often deliberately. And just like any skill, the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes." Now, what does that look like in everyday life? I want to give you some concrete examples because I think this concept of kindness as a practice can feel abstract if we don't ground it in real moments. So, for example, think about the morning commute. You're on a crowded train or bus. Someone drops their bag and things spill everywhere. In that split second, you have a choice. You can look away. Most people do, right? Because it's uncomfortable and you're in a hurry. Or you can bend down and help pick things up. That's kindness in action. It takes maybe 15 seconds of your day. But for that other person, it can completely change the tone of their morning. To give you another example, and this one is a little closer to home perhaps, think about the last time someone at work or in your family was going through a hard time. Maybe they seemed distracted or quieter than usual. Did you notice? And if you did notice, Did you say anything? A lot of us notice and then think, oh, I don't want to pry, they probably want to be left alone. But often, and research really supports this, often what people want most in those moments is simply to feel seen. For instance, just saying, hey, I noticed you seem a bit off today. Are you okay? Can be enormously powerful. It costs you nothing, absolutely nothing, but it can mean everything to the person receiving it. Now, I want to take this a step further, because I think we often underestimate the impact of digital kindness, like the kindness we show online, in messages, in comments, in emails. We tend to think of those as less real than face-to-face kindness. But they're not. They can be just as powerful. To illustrate this, let me share something that happened to a colleague of mine. She had published an article online, something she'd worked on for months. It didn't get a lot of attention at first, and then one day, she got a message from a complete stranger saying simply, I read your article, and it changed how I think about this topic. Thank you. That was it. That was the whole message. She told me she printed it out and kept it on her desk for over a year. As an illustration of the opposite, and I think this is important too, think about how easy it is to be unkind online without even realizing it. For example, leaving no response at all when someone shares something vulnerable. Or sending a quick, cold reply when someone has clearly put effort into their message. These things can hurt. They're not neutral. And I think we forget that because we're not looking the person in the eye. So what's the practice I'm recommending? It's simple. It's not dramatic. Think of it as this. Every day, try to perform one act of deliberate kindness. Not accidental, not just when it's easy. Deliberate. Like, go looking for the opportunity. For example, write a genuine compliment to a colleague in your next email. Or, to give you another example, when you see someone struggling with a door or a heavy bag. Don't wait to see if someone else helps. You do it. Or, for instance, the next time a friend shares something they've created, a piece of writing, a drawing, a business idea, take 2 minutes to really engage with it. Ask a question. Offer a real response. These small things add up. My grandmother was right. Kindness is a muscle. And just like any muscle, it needs to be exercised consistently to stay strong. The beautiful thing is, unlike a lot of things in life, kindness never depletes you. It actually does the opposite. The more you give, the more you seem to have. Think of it like a flame. You can use your flame to light someone else's candle, and your flame doesn't get smaller. It just spreads. What an example that was. Let's count the signals Dr. Samuel used. He used, for example, to introduce the commute scenario. To give you another example, to bring in the workplace scenario. For instance, to offer the specific dialogue example, like to introduce digital kindness casually. To illustrate this, to share the colleague's story. As an illustration of the opposite, to introduce the unkind online behavior example. Think of it as to set up the deliberate kindness concept. For example, again, for the email compliment. To give you another example for the door-holding scenario. For instance, again for engaging with a friend's creation. And finally, think of it like, to close with the flame analogy. That's 11 signaling moments in one talk, and they all felt completely natural. So let's bring it home. We've covered a lot today, and I want you to feel confident about what you've learned. You now know the most common signaling phrases that English speakers use when they're about to give an example. Things like, for example, for instance, such as to illustrate, take, for example, to give you an example, like imagine, picture this, think of it as, it's like, similar to, and many more. You've practiced following these signals in conversations, interviews, and monologues. You've seen how they work in casual and formal contexts. You've noticed how they create chains, where one example leads to another, or where a clarification follows an example. And you've seen how powerful they are for building understanding. Here's my challenge for you this week. Every time you listen to English, whether it's a YouTube video, a podcast, a song, a movie, a conversation, I want you to listen for these signals. Just listen for them. You don't need to write them all down or analyze them perfectly. Just notice them. Because the moment you start noticing them, your listening comprehension will shift. You'll start following longer, more complex speech with so much more ease. And when you're speaking English, try to use them. Instead of just stating your point and moving on, pause. Add an example. Signal it. Say, for example, or like, or imagine. Watch how your speech becomes richer and how the people listening to you understand you better. This is what fluency looks like at the B1 level and beyond. It's not just knowing words. It's knowing how language is organized. It's knowing how speakers build understanding together. I'm so glad you spent this time with me today. If this video helped you, please give it a thumbs up. It genuinely helps this channel reach more learners like you. And if you have a question or you want to share an example you noticed this week, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe to English in Fluency for more lessons just like this one. I'm Alex, and I'll see you in the next video.